Hello everyone, today we come back on the agricultural reorganization of the high Middle Ages in Europe. Recently I've been shifting the attention a little bit from the immediate post-Carolingian times, the political fragmentation and all, towards the 11th century. So here this is mostly going to be a video about the 10th and 11th century, broadly meant. As I think I would like to start to talk a bit about also the recomposition that began to occur into these phases. So naturally this can't even be properly temporally periodized, in the sense that the idea is every place in Europe began to do different things at different times, at different paces, different rhythms, and the whole situation really changed it pretty much. So today, depending on the local base, and so today we're gonna stick essentially to what is more or less feudal Europe, or at least this vassalatic beneficiary Europe, however you want to call it, and see essentially how in these centers, and especially this is an expanding system, so it's not really a specifically geographical area of Europe. It's obvious that the greatest advancements at this point were carried out especially in northern France and northern Italy, but these let's say these models were to by sheer emanatism we could say take over also in the surrounding lands, and not that, by the way, other areas of Europe had not been encompassed. I mean, even central and southern France, or central Italy, or other regions of Germany, the Alpine, I mean, had known this, but there are considerable differences, and naturally we have to scope them in every case, in every say local level, to get a broader picture of the world. In its in essence and in detail. So today naturally we can't do anything but sticking to a generalist perspective, but still there are certain points that are useful to be made. So one thing we stressed usually in the post-Carolingian periods is how the freemen, the class of freemen and peasants, began to lose power during the construction of the seigneurial system, the manorial system, how you want to call it. Well, at this time, towards the 10th and the 11th century, when Europe began to kind of wake up once again from especially second invasions were terrible, had contracted in many ways the European system, but however they were just a sort of consequence of the same political internal fragmentation, not really. I mean, you don't have to think Vikings or Hungars or Saracens to have been what they have been if Carolingian Empire had been actually strong. So we would have had radically different things. But at the same time, it's a serious complex of factors in here that still reminds us nothing is really unidirectional. Today we will talk now, I mean, there's actually a couple of topics I want to address. The first one starts in fact from the peasants and the workers, the laboratores as they were called in Latin. So those who work, or the agricole, that is properly the peasants, that is those who inhabit the agri, the fields, the countryside. So at this point, the responsibility of these peasants was actually increasing. These weren't really slaves who were breaking their backs all the day long. And especially at this point, they, besides the general autonomy that rural communities at many levels still enjoyed, as the local seigneuries were also quite fragmented, and especially also the peasants were quite dynamic from a political and social point of view at this point. However, began to increase their autonomy within the same seigneurial domains. And this was going in parallel with a tendency that was not less interesting, that is the ability of the local lords of business initiative and entrepreneurial reality, how you want to call it. Excuse me, I drink a little. Kind of annoyed because I I had begun to record before, but I forgot to switch the mic on. Actually, I recorded with another mic I had been using yesterday, but kind of talked for half an hour, and now I had just started from scratch because the sound on the other one was awful. Anyhow, we're running a little bit, but I think to get the essentials right. So how was this happening? I mean, it might sound paradoxical that a peasant was framed at this point into the manorial system, so you had a lord, essentially on whom he was depending, could have more autonomy from the same lord. Naturally, we have to understand this, especially in the case of the more powerful seigneuries. I mean, why this happened? Obviously, it's not that the lords were given more more autonomy to the subjects he had for seeing this, creating potentially subversive powers and to overthrow the seigneurial and so on. It was relatively a consideration that looked at what economy at the time was really how it was really transforming. There is an economical revival at this point of medieval Europe that is starting very slowly, and naturally also in here certain areas of Europe kind of rise faster, others have to still wait for a little. But the idea is that the seigneurial system is not at all isolated. Since the very beginning, it's perfectly inserted in the international circuits that are never died out during the early Middle Ages. The intercontinental traffics never died out. There are lots of myths to dispel that are commonly thought about this world of these manners, where it was all about barter and trade at close range, and everybody was kind of enclosed in these castles and these communities. No, absolutely false. This never happened, historically speaking. It was a very open system, very dynamic one, and at this time it's getting even more dynamic. So it's not that the extreme has to be that the extreme has to be the relative point has to be necessarily an extreme. Trade has always been out there. Simply at this time, the lords are actually the ones who are moving the economy. I've made a couple of videos that can be interesting from this point of view in Medieval Society playlist. The one probably most important is the one about the role of cities and the countryside in the revival of medieval Europe. The title is let me check. Countryside and Cities in the Economical Revival of Medieval Europe. It kind of deals with the very important point that it's not that cities at a certain point in all Middle Ages popped out and began to flourish for no reason, reviving the European economy. The thing always started from the countryside. In this sense, urbanism in the low Middle Ages is kind of consequences of that. We have to always bear in mind that these were pre-industrial societies, so agriculturalism is the answer. Always, if you want to understand the Middle Ages, you can't do without understanding how the land was exploited and how it was distributed, what was the general organization. And I know it's kind of boring for someone. Actually, I say this almost every time because I myself am not extremely keen on history of economics, etc. But every time I read about it, I say, wow, this all makes sense, because it objectively shows you and tells you so much about the whole thing. Even if you are interested, I don't know, more specifically in politics or institutions or the military or stuff like that, still you can't avoid to look at society and how the land really worked, because that was really the base of everything. And naturally, every place had different, very different stories, we can say. Even two countries that, let's assume they are perfectly equal, and they have the same population and the same amount of wealth in the whole system, but they still differ radically, at least not necessarily radically, but it still can differ a lot on the basis of how that wealth is distributed. And so this is why the Middle Ages are arguably mostly interesting in the local differences, at least in my opinion, that we don't have time to cover, but it's always important to bear it in mind. So the peasants who were more affected by this kind of autonomy were the ones of the massarii. So these were basically the lords kind of so here we are also talking about the most powerful lords, so not lords that are, as we were saying before, doing this for free or because they were good and all, because they were probably even more powerful than the others, so they had a much greater deterrent than others. So especially if you look at France at this time, you realize already by the 10th, 11th centuries there were certain provincial lords that were as powerful as the French kings. If you take the counts of Champagne, the Duke of Aquitaine, or Normandy, or these were still great, building very solid dominions. And at this point, it wasn't really a matter of controlling every single peasant family and what it was doing. The really important thing now was to make the market more dynamic. So these lords understood that by giving more autonomy, more responsibility, because this was still framed, however, into the feudal hierarchy. So it's not that this went out of this, but they understood practically that by giving more autonomy to the management of these of the peasant properties, they could have made a lot more of money themselves. And this is a kind of also pretty interesting lesson in economical terms, that when there is a too oppressive direction of economy, you're basically gonna lose wealth. You're gonna compromise production. So they needed the lords at this point being the wealthiest being the wealthiest people. So being those who had the largest properties and the greatest capitals. They understood that if you wanted to grow competitive and to make more money also in the market, etc., they had naturally to leave a certain degree of they had to let these communities breathe and to reorganize on their own. So this goes along naturally also with a very attentive interest towards local the organization of the local territory, especially infrastructures that were vital for trade. Naturally, I also made a video recently about the communication routes on the Middle Ages. If you're interested in it, the title is something like, give me a second, Medieval Roads and Communication Routes. That also talks about the difficulties of putting, once again, Europe in shape. Now I'm using this kind of very approximate definition. It was something very low, very very slow, very progressive. It wasn't something happened from one day to another, but definitely you can argue that this all started from also this territorial reorganization of the seigneurial estates that were looking with extreme care at things, especially like bridges, and because, by the way, it wasn't just a matter of viability. To cross with a terrestrial road the rivers, but also controlling the same river traffics. So building a bridge was usually fortified. You could exact tolls and absorbing revenues, etc. So another myth, however, we have to get rid of when thinking of Middle Ages, and this terrible lords were all just stealing money and keeping them in their castles and letting the peasants starve. Actually, it was pretty much standard at this point, just like in other times in history, in this clienteling system, to have a cyclical redistribution of the resources. So you can argue that all the tolls, the taxes, and other exactions and corvée, so these kind of unduted, what a beautiful, what a bad term, you know what the corvée are, um, were were actually redistributed into the territory. Well, yeah, of course, with other logics, it was naturally in order also to strengthen the seigneurial power, but this was so much more complicated and fragmented than we can imagine. Also, this strict let's say geometrical territorial dimension of these lordships. Sometimes you get in the medieval manuals these kind of cute drawings with, you see the castle at the center and all the village around, and then the land around. Well, yeah, that's kind of an ideal thing. These territorial domains were much less, at least at a first sight, rationally built. But telling the truth, they still followed a iron logic in the way they were built, as it was just the political fragmentation that brought to that, where seigneuries that had properties even hundreds of kilometers away, it was extremely dynamic. Naturally, also in here, there was a big deal of difference between certain areas of Europe and others. I mean, there were certain areas where naturally there was more literacy, there were more written contracts. Those were the areas that were also economical, more dynamic, and more effervescent, if you want. But also in here there are differences, whereas you realize before we mentioned northern France and northern Italy. Well, these areas were the most advanced at the time in land exploitation, were also radically different. Like in northern France, it was mostly these very powerful seigneurial figures that owned a huge amount of land, and they kind of made, I can say, kingdoms on their own. But as we have said before, in the case of France, they were extremely powerful domains, very large and very much more centralized. If you take northern Italy this time, you realize that the per capita wealth was higher, but everything was kind of more fragmented. So this saw the rise even of certain of Encastellation in very different ways that it happened in France. Castles were built sometimes not even just to be used by the builder, but just to be sold. So it's kind of also here very different worlds. But the importance of this is that the whole society was kind of revolving around these transformations and progressively expanding as a system. So those peasants were more favored by this form of autonomizations, were the ones living in the massarii. So these area that didn't fully pertain to the lord's property, but that had contracted this relation with the seigneurial power, and that was, however, tied to this. And this was overly complicated, naturally, by the fact that there was an awful competition between, say, all the local communities. I mean, the same peasants sometimes, asked help, sought protection from different lords at once, and maybe were rivals, and therefore exploiting their attrition to grow instead, in the meanwhile, their own autonomy. So it was a very complex scenario, but this, however, adds up to the complexity of the forms of interaction that were developed. So this is also why this is a very important moment in history for development of also of contracts, or and the general revival of also commercial practices, the spread of literacy, especially in certain contexts, and more generally this growth. There was actually also a material growth, because the resources were increasing. So this is important. The lord is not just a military guy. It's not just one person that remains, in the castle during winter and in summer goes to war, and that's it. These lords were becoming de facto businessmen, and they were actually the ones who were more directly involved into the the economical revival of low medieval Europe. And the ones who actually put those resources in motion and helped to frame them into a more rational and organized system, arrangement, how you want to call it, and therefore also make literally shifting all these massive agricultural resources intercontinentally. And this is why at this time the main European trade axis, think about the one between, I don't know, the Flanders, the Champagne fairs in northern Italy. Well, this was to remain, especially between Flanders and northern Italy, the axis of medieval trade forever, even during the modern age, before eventually the Atlantic routes eventually took over. But this was pretty much it, and it remained. But this started from the lords. So even the opposition, this is something, especially in certain countries, is not really felt, especially those countries who had a lesser degree of urbanization. Probably also the local historiographies have remained more generally stuck to the idea of feudalism as the leading thing, and as feudalism as a kind of a positive model to the communal world. But telling the truth, this is not true. Actually, the same communal world was born from these rural aristocrats. At a certain point, kind of gentrified. They understood that the most profitable business was the one was now forming around the cities. So they kind of abandoned the countryside that had been normally the natural environment of these post-Carolingian lords, and by the way, maintaining ties with the naturally the rural world, because as we were saying before, cities at this point were born because cities naturally in large sometimes at large already existed, and also in here depends on which area of Europe we're talking about. But generally speaking, what is important to stress is how the city developed also thanks to these relations, thanks to the capitals, to the resources that came from the countryside. And this is pretty much evident. So those videos I advised you before are very, very important to look at this, because sometimes there is this very political view of looking at kind of this polarized political view that it was the commoners versus the knights. Not really. It was a very cooperative and very naturally there were lots of contrasts. Of course, there were very different cultures, very different political cultures, and especially. But everything had especially been born through the cooperations of these elements. It was normal at the time. It was really the cities that were the anomaly in this sense. To grow undetached eventually from the seigneurial power, albeit eventually not making it to become fully independent. Not even when they practically even managed to defeat the nobiliar presence. But this is another topic. So another very important thing I want to stress today is how these new forms of land management literally reshaped the face of the European landscape. Okay, now we've built skyscrapers and highways, and also we we radically changed the landscape ourselves. We kind of laugh thinking about what the medieval times could do, but there is really nothing to laugh about it, because there were certain areas of Europe that literally changed face because of the expansion of Frankish feudalism and its management forms. And there is a beautiful, in here I cannot but advise you the historiography of the school of the Les Annales that dealt with this, especially so-called historical geography. That is a very fascinating topic. I'm not an expert on at all on the Les Annales, but it's the least I can advise you if you are interested in these topics, as they take into consideration the whole, especially the settlement. Naturally, it's a structuralist perspective of the European communities at the time, and making it a point, naturally, not just of medieval settlements, but how essentially these these eminently agricultural societies organized themselves since prehistory, so since agriculturalism had set in, and therefore looking at how even our own world today is actually shaped in great part of what was on the base of what was done in the Middle Ages, and trying to understand why a community settled and developed in one place, or a certain point declined and starts building somewhere else. So this is also very important, because there was a big deal of intervention of seigneurial power in these dynamics. And this is what we're gonna see. Basically, the lords promoted the shifting of groups of, the moving of certain group of peasant families towards other centers of agrarian reorganization, we can say. And we're talking especially into areas like villages. So these essentially houses with surrounded by more scattered forms of settlement, like farmhouses or farmsteads, and with a very wide area instead of cultivating area in the outer side was that was destined to sowing was. So this was basically the outset. They were these villages were built more or less in this fashion. So with a center and also in here, especially we're talking about the rural world. So these weren't really cities. So you had the central villages that still had vegetable gardens all around. Then other scattered settlements for families who lived more in direct contact with the outer greater fields, and it is these massive fields that pertained all to the various families. So this was important because it basically it's something that naturally also in here developed very progressively, very slowly, but sometimes it was created out of scratch. And this is what feudalism also did in areas that had not known these forms of permanent settlement, especially in those areas that had not enjoyed let's say the Roman pacification, let's say. But I'm just kidding now, but it's pretty obvious that the territories of the Roman Empire were incidentally the ones where these more ancient forms of settlements had already existed. It wasn't really just about the Romans. These forms of more sanitary settlement existed since prehistory, naturally, but you can argue that the Roman Empire basically expanded on the base of these. So as long as a fully sanitarized society was supportable, the Romans expanded. the outside was not so. So what was happening in this time is that Frankish feudalism is expanding also in two areas that had not been formerly part of the Roman world, that had not known those forms of sedentarization and settling before. And this had advantages because you could do that out of scratch, especially with reclamations and deforestations. You could create these wide areas where to settle and to exploit the surrounding fields if there were any, and therefore starting a new center that, as a lord, you could also more directly manage in this sense, because it was created by you. So implicitly, this was your own property. And naturally, you needed peasants, settlers, to go there, living in there, which they would do, but they were still, in this sense, on your own land that you had created with your own rights, your own authority, and that now you were exploiting to make these people work for you, essentially. So this was naturally profitable also for many people that at this point were searching for a settlement, because you know that a big deal also of the European economical expansion at this point wasn't really anything technologically meant. I mean, there is the cute story that one day the Europeans discovered things, I don't know, like the heavy the heavy plow with the iron metal parts and so on. Oh, they start doing that, and then they invented the tripartite rotation, crops rotation system, and so the crop rate began to higher. No, the crop rate seemingly remained the same throughout all this time. There was no real technological advancement. It was just a different form of agricultural organization that in this sense has to be understood as more effective because it was regulated from the above, from these seigneurial powers, which is very, very different from saying, okay, now just we are a bunch of scattered people from nowhere that start settling to one place individually with a sort of very egalitarian kind of society where everybody has his own land. And this is very different from a seigneurial estate. And it is true that there are regions where naturally crop rate increased, but there are regions where this doesn't happen and where still feudalism was expanding. And therefore you have to understand that this economical revival, feudal Europe, is actually a much broader phenomenon that more or less happened at that time, and that is very based in time and space, that corresponded mostly to a political and social change than any kind of true technological progress that brought to these new forms of agricultural production. This is at least what the most advanced historiography is pointing out, because there is actually no proof that once around the year 1000 Europe began to flourish once again. This is a brutal approximation of a phenomenon that is extremely more complex, especially extremely also more complicated to assess in certain cases, especially the more you look into detail. It happens very often in this fashion that there are certain phenomena that, if you look close, they kind of do not exist. Just if you look for it from perspective, they can start to have a form. And I know something about this because it's causing me extremely heavy methodological problems in my current studies. So it's something I feel very much. So this is also a way to exercise your own criticism. You say, oh well, this happened, and there is someone else asks you, why, how, prove me that, and you go prove that, you realize that, hey, maybe it wasn't really like that, it was more complicated. And this is how essentially you learn history, because learning history is this continuous kind of correction of your beliefs. It's not a strengthening of your beliefs. I mean, it's naturally strengthening of certain opinions in front of evidence, etc. But most of the times you realize something so extremely complicated that it's impossible to be expert in one's life if not on very narrow topics to tell it all, compared to the amount of information that is present out there. So these were settlement. I mean, and the idea of resettling someone is something that maybe surprises us, or we haven't fully focused as at this point perfectly sedentary civilizations. But it was actually normal during ancient medieval times to resettle populations here and there, and this happened both naturally in the nomadic world, but as well as in the sedentary one. The Frankish feudalism was ruling over lands that by now were fully sedentarized. So these were relocated elsewhere. And these were sometimes good opportunities. Also because, as we were saying now, in the point before, these settlements were somehow also kind of advantageous, as in terms of contracts. You also, because if you're a lord and you have spent so much money, invested so many resources in building this new cool village somewhere, and you make inconvenient contracts that are nobody will come to inhabit your village, that you're gonna just lose it all. So and this is also how many populations in Europe, especially in Central Europe, blended heavily in. There is a big deal if you take the Ostsiedlung, so-called, this expansion towards the east, to the German lands. You realize that many settlers now, or there is a literal shift of certain populations from places to others. And this was also a way to build up certain local identities. And this is also something we properly rarely think. That is that previously to the nation state, the actual perception of identity was more based on these seigneurial relations. I mean, surely, yeah, there was a kind of national, proto-national identity relatively to language and all, but some of the same had been born actually through these phenomena. And what was more important allegedly was, under which lord you were, so which rights you had, and this was very important because they were bonds. And if you go even more back in time, we see that was even before in all the societies in fully sedentarized world. The idea that it's not really important where you are, but by what conditions you are there. Who is ruling over you, and in which relations this kind of in which terms this is actually put. So whatever. Now I don't want to go much. So it's important to look at this kind of tripartition of the soil. So imagine you have your house in the village with a vegetable garden. Then you have, that a bit outwards of the village you have a land that is yours, and you can use to do whatever you as a family nucleus wanted to do with that. Then there was even an outer circle where there was a sort of uncultivated area that was a bit for common use. So often also for cattle, and or maybe gathering, because at this point, especially these outer areas, naturally, if they were more distant from the center of the village, you can imagine it to be even more forested, for instance. And the forests were so important for the resources you could go pick up in there. And in this sense, the forest is difficultly billeted. I mean, it's just that the whole ecosystem works like that. So in fact, forests at this time were extremely prized, and they were usually a seigneurial possession. Back in the day, they were all royal. Now, kingdoms had fragmented. I mean, royal authority had fragmented. So guess what seized the forest was the lords. And there are so many beautiful documents also, especially in these countries where there were more forests at this point. We're a bit like in a hybrid in between this Frankish world and still the wild ones of the barbaricum, like Germany. Well, Germany were forests that were extremely important for the local life, for the local politics and society and economy, and they're very interesting to study. So, as we were saying, this form of tripartition of the soil was already known before, so it was not a feudal invention. However, it was expanded into territories that had never known it, and therefore changing radically their face. And this wasn't just a merely economical thing. It was really all one with politics and society. You know, even all the just imagine, I don't know, the Slavic powers at this time that had never known that kind of models, and they enter into contact with the Carolingians, and they kind of on the eastern frontier, and they kind of or the Danes. This is valid also for the Scandinavian powers. So they start looking at these models, and especially the aristocracies, to say, why don't we imitate them? Because this means to centralize our power in a world that, in fact, beyond feudalism, was not very centralized at all. So that was a very viable opportunity, and you see why, I don't know, these Slavic powers, I don't know, Bohemia or Poland, or even the Danes or Hungary were in other were so attracted also by immaterial culture, and this went all in parallel with everything, kind of, even military style, etc. So this is also part of the reason why Frankish feudalism was so successful, because it kind of worked, and it entailed certain settling models that were quite profitable for the aristocracies involved. The same goes for Christianization. If you take the Danes, well, those were Christianized just like other powers, because they feared, first of all, to be invaded by the Franks at one point, but also because the Christianization entailed a certain type of settlement. Christianization required dioceses, and hence, at least in the Frankish model, a naturally sort of urbanization, because dioceses were into the cities, and therefore having a kind of an administrative structure attached to it with the church that could, in this sense, also cooperate with the local kingship to reorganize the territory, to grow as to make increase the importance of aristocracies, so all very complex transformations that, however, we're looking at what was done essentially into this Frankish, therefore northern French and kind of Belgian and world, geographically speaking. That's the reason why eventually this was exported with the Normans in England and in Sicily, but sometimes there wasn't even the need of exporting it physically. I think in northern Spain, those guys kind of got feudalized by simply imitating the Franks. This goes also for the Slavs who we're talking about, especially the Western Slavs. And this affected really many. Even the Byzantine Empire, arguably, at a certain point, was heavily, was essentially imitating the Franks. Especially in later times. Frankish feudalism. Think about Manuel I Comnenus, that was trying to transform the Byzantine Empire into something a bit more feudal-like, because he had understood that paradoxically it could be feudalism could be a more unifying, gluing factor, or a gluing system than paradoxically a centralized organization was that gravitated mostly just around Constantinople. So these are also things I've just hinted at in my videos, but these are really important things we rarely hear, if not on proper academic sources and all, and still I think they should be known. This is the reason why I'm discussing them here, because I'm trying to make a bit of disclosure for people who have maybe never heard these things, and they were like the probably the ABC to in that world, to even to understand it for us today. So what else can we say now? Also in here, these forms of settlements had been partly naturally, you can imagine there were many reasons, many factors that brought to these new forms of organization. The second invasions were not extraneous from this, because of all these continuous Viking, Saracen and Hungar raids, Europe was trying also to organize its spaces in a safer way. This happened, we say that many times in the videos on Encastellation, that's really mostly also because of the local conflicts. It's not that, you know, the whole problem at this point were the second invaders. There was a lot of warfare going on between the same Christians in the post-Carolingian world. However, we can't say that there was a lot of factors coming together. I mean, even the same Germanic invasions during the migration era had brought to this. You can argue this also in the late Empire, that there had been a kind of a different reorganization of political centers. Even if you look, I don't know, at the Diocletian and Constantinian's reforms, you look at essentially the territory of the empire was billeted in much smaller provinces to administrate it kind of more directly, kind of also increasing, in this sense, not the local freedom, but however the local control, but kind of having a margin of autonomy in doing this to react more quickly. This is kind of similar. This is started kind of happening once again in feudalism, especially with the building of monarchies and all. So this decentralized administration, paradoxically, in part, is still more functional than a centralized one that requires a structure that you can't really have. So sometimes in order to control the territory in these conditions, it's better to have, paradoxically, a decentralized government. So the main, because of all the warfare, the ongoing warfare, naturally one of the main needs of these new villages was to be built into safer areas, often elevated on high grounds, and this is this happened largely also spontaneously. You know, if you look at the end of the late antique period, especially in certain areas of Europe where there had been devastating wars, etc., you realize that there is a change, very also in here, very progressive, very slow change, also in the settlements, in the locations. Maybe, I don't know, there was a Roman city that was not even a city, but let's put it like a vicus, a place that was a village there, and because we get this only from archaeology most of the times, especially for the early Middle Ages, and we know that, we see that, I don't know, in ancient times this place was populated regularly, continuously, and it was a florid traffic and all. Then you see maybe towards the 6th century that this place is kind of declining, and there is maybe a smaller settlement close, but maybe over a hill or in another elevated position that is more it's easier to defend, especially that maybe had existed also in previous times, but it was just like a smaller detachment. Maybe there was just of the settlement. Maybe there was just a church or a chapel or another minor settlement, and that instead gains importance. And maybe the larger settlement doesn't even decay more than much. The two centers keep existing. But still there are these changes, and since the tendency is to centralize at this point and also on safer grounds, naturally what you have on average in these new settlements is, in these settlements, let's say it better, is that they have a greater strategical value. Because maybe in ancient times that had mostly an economical value, so that because that the previous settlements had been built mostly for agricultural reasons. Like, the Romans managed to pacify these huge areas of Europe, so that what they start doing is just to cultivate in them, so that they were at least to the time there were no incursions. You don't do it. When war starts to break up, Roman Empire collapses, and there are all the invasions, and then there is this kind of messy situation. Your settlements are gonna have mostly kind of strategical importance. Well, since the Middle Ages keep going on with this, because there is no further centralization like in Roman times, but on the contrary, it is kind of sinusoid, kind of floating, swinging passage from various degrees of fragmentation. What you see is these centers remain important, especially for military reasons. And this is where the lords that naturally were living in there began to look at these settlements with great interest. Because obviously by seizing them, they would have managed to strengthen their own power, and that's why they began to promote, if they could, certain regrouping over these pre-existing settlements sometimes, or as we've seen, also creating new ones that could at the same time extend the seigneurial control of the population, and at the same time creating more organical agrarian spaces, if you want. At this time, the abbeys were starting to do that. That abbeys were extremely powerful at this point. They had a huge they were some of the most powerful lords at the time, and that by getting bit by bit, especially certain through donations, pious donations, etc., they started kind of putting hands a bit everywhere. I know it sounds bad, but it's really what happened, and therefore they had often more opportunities even to expand on more on certain particular areas, and having a in profiting from it. So what you see in here, however, and what I want to stress here is how these settlements were directed and managed from the above. So it's how these villages were not really they had a broader strategical dimension, a broader strategical reason. They're not simple spontaneous settlements that pop out by themselves. They're something that are favored in their expansion, in their development, and that have a function. So this naturally adds also up to the to the degree of social complexity of this all, because this goes on literally for the whole Middle Ages, and you realize that there were certain centers that were also in competition one against the other, were backed by this or that power, and that flourished or decayed accordingly. And this is very complicated even to retrace, historically speaking, because there were so many factors involved, some of which unfortunately we will never know, as we lack the sources for them, that really complicated the situation. So sometimes I guess the favored strategy at this point is really try to take one single center's perspective and trying to see what it was without enlarging too much, unless naturally you can't trace this broader net. But it can be really, really complicated, and especially in strictly historical terms, this is kind of fascinating because these are things that kind of never end. Especially for the Middle Ages, you can't retake these sources and re-looking at them and reformulating and rethinking them. So it's a very fertile. The Middle Ages is a very fertile ground because there is a certain degree of unknown that complicates the whole thing, and that gives you room for even speculations and stuff. As many historians know, when they have to invent the always new articles just to see them published. They can't invent even the worst rubbish just to. So there is why there is this tendency today to kind of making it all kind of problematic. The idea that it's always a problem. It's difficult to define. What does it mean to define? There are entire branches of academical research dedicated just to the point of how can you define this thing as such. I'm more of a pragmatic person, so I kind of this kind of makes me laugh a little bit, but it's still important by some measure, because sometimes you arrive studying history with certain beliefs, certain prejudices, if you want, and then you read this thing, and the most beautiful thing is arguably understanding it's all different, because it makes you really amazed by and it really pushes you to be wanted to learn it more, because it's a kind of a beautiful feeling as well. At least for me, it's kind of exciting to say, oh wow, this is not just like I thought. It's way more complex, it's way more shaded. And now, however, I can see that, and before I couldn't. So paradoxically, it's acquiring knowledge from a certain type of ignorance, and that also this is what Popper said in a nutshell. I mean, however, still there is some kind of safe ground of hardware. Let's say you can say, well, okay, this is the datum we had. And yeah, it might be even false, but we're wrong with it. At least, however, there is not much more we can add. Especially, it's very difficult for the early Middle Ages to add much more to what is already being said, because and that's where you kind of understand why history is getting so political, because sometimes it's not even a strictly historical matter that is being discussed, but really the approach or the idea behind that. And this is something that I'm really not very I really don't like much, but this is how the academies are transforming essentially, and it's a shame, telling the truth. In part it also produces something good. Now I don't want to make it dramatic, but we're getting too much lost in details, in my opinion. Kind of diverting increasingly from the overall picture that it's still kind of important to have in mind. Even if it's an approximation, it cannot avoid to be an approximation, but it's still something that makes you reason in broader terms. So when just you got the basis, you should go into details and not really the other way around, at least. So in this, I forgot to mention naturally, but it goes without saying that encastlement had an excruciating importance, and probably what I said today fully explains indirectly what I mean when I say that encapsulation is not something that was born because of the second invasions, but it really came from these new needs of local control. I mean, surely the second invasions had an influence on encapsulations, where certain areas that became encastled naturally because of the various raids that existed in there, but most of the times it's not really the case. It was the same local lords that wanted to extend their power over these centers, and for this reason building castles in there, because otherwise the castles were used to stamp. The second invasions were actually something pretty smaller, with a more strictly, exclusively military function, whereas castles had also a broader function sometimes. Also warehouses of different, and the idea is, however, castles, the biggest castles, and the one parts also the ones that remained from those times, were built expressly for remaining for controlling these wealthy areas. And incidentally, this is obvious also because those were the regions where there were more resources to spend to build castles, were something pretty imposing and very expensive at the time. So the idea is just think it from the lord perspective. Now you want to, there is a fertile area you want to claim and to so you carry out a reclamation in there. You deforestate it, and you start building this village. What you do is also to build a castle next to it, so that you can control it. So even the expansion of these communities, as we were saying at the beginning, it's not really devoid of control. The peasants have to work with that contract for the lord, and having always a castle, kind of a grim thing that reminded them that if they kind of got unfaithful, unloyal, let's say, the lord was always there with his military presence. But this was getting also, as we've seen, very dynamic, because this time the same seigneuries were pretty unstable, so those castles could be used also by other people who kind of not even generally, not necessarily just conquered that through force. They could buy the castle, something that happened more frequently than one might think. And this was all backed, however, usually by this seigneurial force. It was, however, the aristocracies that were taking over. It doesn't matter whether they were the same actual person, but there was still this kind of class of milites that carried out this, and the church. So these were both lay and ecclesiastical lords. And there are many beautiful examples all over Europe of these dynamics. There are also many beautiful studies concerning this. One of the most beautiful ones is Toubert's one, especially on the region of around Rome. For instance, a very powerful lords at this time in the area were the abbeys of Subiaco and Farfa. In this region of Lazio and Sabina, that were exploiting in were at the same time affected by, in this case, also by the second invasions, as the Saracens had made it into central Italy up to there at one point. Kind of happened just like once, but that's how far they could go. Inland as well. I never think the Saracens were just a maritime thing. They reached Germany through land from southern France at one point, so it's not something you. And so if you study the sources of these, that by the way were produced, especially in these abbeys, that naturally, as we were saying before, the monks were literate. They wrote down, and especially it's very sad even to think that most of the documents we have at this point survive only from the abbeys, because we don't have most of the times nor the one of the nobles, of the lay nobles, nor of the peasants, obviously. And sometimes we know about that perspective only from the abbeys documents, that, by the way, usually were produced by only in that case into which the abbey had eventually obtained one right over these communities, and this usually happened during a trial. Usually it was plenty at this time of the local noble or abbey or peasant community that kind of quarreled, and they appealed to the royal power, and they said, okay, here we have our rights, we have our witnesses, we have our previous documents. So here, especially in the case of Italy, that is extremely advanced. There's plenty of documentation, and there was this placitum, so called in Latin. So this is kind of trial with all the proper. They were very, these were very important occasions, as you can imagine. There were, and all these placita, it's the plural placitum in Latin, were written down. Were they had documents that said, that put it on paper. Well, paper usually was not, this time was not really there. Put it on pergamon. That that community had this right, was sanctioned by the public authority of the king or his representatives and all, etc. What is beautiful is that we have all the kind of list of this, of how the trial happened. Usually the two parties called up the witnesses and said, and it's very fascinating, especially because sometimes, I mean, these things were written in Latin naturally, but sometimes you have of these witnesses the actual vernacular that was said at the time, or at least something halfway between Latin and vernacular still, so that you can even kind of analyze the register of these witnesses, and it's beautiful because you realize naturally that the signatures are incredible. You see the notaries as some of the most educated men in Europe, arguably the most educated men in Europe at the time. It had these beautiful signatures with their own signum. In fact, it was not just a name, but a kind of a symbol, kind of a drawing. It was usually a cross with certain character that those expressed that guy was so educated. It has even its own signum, etc. Then maybe someone of lower status wrote down just like a smaller signum and a kind of a very difficultly readable signature, and that's kind of already a very advanced thing. In most of Europe, actually, you don't have this in this time, where areas of Europe still went on with oral, trials and stuff like that. So you can't imagine even here the sensible differences. And these abbeys naturally show us, in fact, mostly those, the documents that these abbeys preserved were logically only the ones that of the won trials, right? So only the trials that put black on white over white, that the abbey had won that trial, and therefore had got the recognition of that specific right. That was usually the right over a community, over a certain amount of land. And from these documents we can actually assess also what kind of how these territorial reorganizations actually took place, because some of them were quite subtle, especially in the areas that were anciently developed, like in fact Italy. In Northern Europe, in Germany, you have different things. You have instead more the makes you more understand how these new lands that were essentially colonized towards the east were actually there is this great effort of claiming back these lands from nature and to populate them. So there are completely different dynamics. Whereas in these more populated, more developed societies of Southern Europe, you find essentially powers that were subtly kind of entering into the sphere of others, and especially putting their hands over that land and claim. And I say these are very interesting trials, because nothing was very simple to determine, and it wasn't just a matter of because the public authorities sometimes, in order to solve these problems, carried out their own kind of survey of investigations, so to figure out whether the witnesses were saying the truth. There are certain documents here that date back to the Longobard times that they called up a huge amount of witnesses. You understand there that the public authority really did an outstanding job, but really going in there, asking people, and what this reveals to you is, wow. I mean, when you read these sources, you just say, wow, but was that word so dynamic? That's where you go in depth, you go kind of straight to the source, to the spring of history, and you say, oh, but therefore that is the world that existed and that we never talk about because we think that these were the Dark Ages. An extremely dynamic world that we don't see, but it's hidden underneath those sources. You can fully see really the how there was so much life, and it's something amazing. I don't know, it's probably one of the things that make me more emotional when studying history. I mean, to realize that we're these people that not only we don't know anything about them, but we still pretend to judge from today's easy life. And this is well, maybe I will have the chance to explain this better one time, but it's really at this point that you fall in love with history, even if you manage to arrive at this point. In my case, it happened before, but I wish I'm telling you these things because I wish that if you just came across this video by chance, and maybe you had not even posed yourself these problems, just to know that this is like that. This is like it. I mean, if you go there and you check, it's really like this, and I urge you to do it if you've never done it, because it's a beautiful experience. It tells you so much. It makes you reflect. It's not just about knowing people who lived 1,000 years ago. It's just what it means, because those people are essentially just what we are. And it tells us so much about ourselves. And this is why I study history, because it gives me, it's really beautiful. So just to conclude, we mentioned before these abbeys of Subiaco and Farfa in these regions around the region of central Italy, and that is a very important. Always, I recommend you once again the Tubert's studies on this, because that's a particularly happy example in European history of how encastellation practically works. In fact, in the case of the region around Rome, what you see that encastellation is actually starting in the 10th century, the beginning of the 10th century, just after the end of the Saracen invasions. In 915, basically the Pope with all the other forces in Italy make to destroy the Saracen base on the Garigliano River, from which the Saracens had been launching these raids across the, sacking even basilicas of St. Peter, St. Paul, and arriving as deep as Farfa in Sabina. But it's pretty far inland, actually, so that's why I was mentioning the thing before. And what you see is, once the Saracens basically never come back at that point, it's only at this point that encastellation starts. And you say, wow, why is that? Well, why is that? Because when there are raids out there, who does venture to build a castle that can be destroyed? It can be when there is an economical contraction, where the where the connections are not sure. How can you put in motion something like that? So what you see, the Saracens are kicked out. Now the Roman lords begin to build lots of castles around Rome, and to reorganize this also rather fertile area, by the way, especially in the south of Rome. That was very profitable for them to do, and that's when encastellation starts. And this is how it happens in most of Europe. So it's pretty rare that you have a castle that is going to remain because, I don't know, the Vikings are raiding there. Certain regions, I can assume, especially in the region of Benelux, so this area that was pretty much close to Denmark and to pretty open to the North Sea without any major natural obstacle. It's just mostly flat land. That the local communities were first of all issued by the Carolingian, the dying Carolingian powers, laws of kind of self-government in some measure, and they started building castles. And I'm never read from that area, telling you the truth. It would be interesting to know how it happened in there, and you can argue that those were kind of the most exposed areas to Viking raids, and it's kind of normal that the local fortresses were built to meet this kind of regular threat. But in other areas of Europe, the second invasions were actually pretty rare. Like France was the most targeted in many ways, especially by the Vikings. But if you take the very heart of France, especially in the east, or western Germany, or southern Germany, there were the Hungars in there as well. But if you look at when these incursions happened, they kind of happen once every, every several years. So it's not something that really, they could made a lot of damage, but it's not that they were so capillary or so excruciatingly intense. And what you see instead is that castles are flourishing all around, for dynamics that have just partly and very often a few to do with those incursions. And that's why Europeans, by the way, keep building castles even after these incursions, by the way, and especially after these incursions. Because those had brought a moment of general crisis that also made it, the 10th century is known especially as the Iron Century, like a bit like the 17th later on. There are these centuries that have this fame of brutal periods of especially a lot of wars. Yeah, it is true, but and this makes you understand how even economy kind of partly contracted at that point. So even investing into castles said, okay, but who knows we will be like in 10 years, so let's wait, let's arrange the defense in a different fashion, let's maybe operate politically to achieve that. Look at what the Ottonians did in Germany. I mean, well, this is a very good example, because the Ottonians built up, they were Saxon, as you know. They built up a freaking lot of castles into Saxony, and most of these castles were not directly exposed to, massive threats. Yeah, there were like the Slavs in the east, they were on the Elbe, and the Saxon kind of pushed them a little bit eastwards. And also in the north, there were the Danes that were kind of still, at this point they had converted, I think, if I'm not wrong. But however, there were still kind of a threat, but it's not. There was these major hammering invasions, like instead it happened in a bit like in southern Germany with the Angers. So actually, in the case of the Saxons, what the German princes do is basically to confer them the power, because they already had lots of military power, and because of that, castles as well. So because they had managed to organize the territory through that, not just to defend it, but really control the resources of the territory from those castles. That's the key point to understand it. And therefore, what the Saxons do is began to organize, to mount up these expeditions against the Hungers. You can't just defend behind a castle, you have to counterattack, otherwise those guys are keeping doing that. You can even close yourself into the castle and let the surrounding countries to be ravaged. It's not really the best option anyway. I mean, it's just an emergential reason in part. So also in here there were other means to counter the second invasions, and the castles weren't really the elementary thing to do it, at least not fully, as and as also the local lords were often had to be fenced off in such a way. However, we ended up talking about these castles once again. But anyhow, so this is more or less what I wanted to say today. How is it long? 1 hour and 23. Well, it's fine. So I'm sorry, because actually the first 30 minutes I had recorded at the beginning, definitely aborting eventually. The thing were probably a better introduction, but I think towards the end I kind of added enough informations to make it clear. Okay, so for now I think it's enough, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.